ready whenever you gentlemen are ready.
Sounds good.
Wish you both the best of luck.
Thank you. All right. Assuming everyone's ready, 6 minutes will begin on my first word. I affirm the resolution resolved the United States ought to become party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and or the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Because the resolution uses the term and or, I will be choosing to defend the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in this debate, also known as UNCLOS. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, UNCLOS sets forth a comprehensive legal framework for the use and protection of the sea, including both natural and cultural resources. The convention establishes guidelines with respect to states' navigational rights, maritime zones, and boundaries in economic jurisdiction, while also providing member states a mechanism for international cooperation and dispute resolution. For my framework, my value is morality because ought in the resolution implies a moral obligation according to Merriam-Webster. Moreover, my value criterion is maximizing general well-being. My main justification is the principle of utility. All other things we can value can be explained in reference to well-being, which makes it the ultimate value. Because all people are fundamentally morally equal, we ought to take actions that maximize well-being and minimize suffering collectively. Second, policymakers may not be sure exactly how our actions affect every person, but they can act in terms of the overall well-being of society. Philosopher Dr. Robert Gooden writes that public officials are poorly informed as to the effects their choices will have on individuals one by one. What they do know are averages and aggregates, what will happen most often to most people as a result of their choices. That is enough to allow policymakers to use a utilitarian calculus. My sole contention is U.S. credibility. Ratification of UNCLOS increases U.S. credibility and removes the Sino-Russian diplomatic high ground. Overfield 24 explains that ratifying UNCLOS would pull the carpet out from under cynical Russian and Chinese attempts to paint the U.S. as an international rule breaker. Washington views UNCLOS as largely reflecting customary law binding on all states, including the U.S., but remaining outside of the treaty leaves Washington vulnerable to accusations that its disagreements with other states over maritime issues are illegitimate or based on nebulous, cherry-picked law. For example, the Russian Foreign Ministry alleged that Washington's unilateral steps are not in accordance with international law. Russia criticizes the U.S.'s use of international law, stressing rights and completely ignoring obligations, as just the latest example of its attempts to exploit UNCLOS for purely its own interests. Ratification would plug a glaring gap in the U.S. position that opens it up to charges of hypocrisy. Maintaining the democratic global order is critical for global stability. As Kasparov writes in 2017, that strategic stability is the great strength of democracies. Strong institutions allow for long-range planning. Democracy is the only proven remedy for nearly every crisis. War, famine, poverty, terrorism are all generated and exacerbated by authoritarian regimes. There are two important scenarios. First is the South China Sea, or SCS. UNCLOS ratification bolsters the U.S. leadership position and undercuts Chinese criticism. Dharma 121 explains that ratifying UNCLOS would live up to rhetoric on American leadership and multilateralism. As China's influence grows, it is more likely that there will be more maritime incidents and more dangerous ones in the South China Sea. U.S. activities would gain more support and legitimacy if the U.S. ratified UNCLOS. Specifically, the affirmative prevents miscalculation in the SCS by increasing U.S. credibility and strengthening alliances. Dean Feynman of the Fordham University School writes in 2024 that ratification would empower the U.S. to confront Chinese overreach. In particular, it would offer diplomatic avenues to avoid conflicts as well as dispute settlement mechanisms to resolve them. We undermine our leverage by not signing up to the same rulebook. Allies see U.S. non-membership as a liability and as a condition more likely to disrupt and frustrate regional stability than to achieve strategic goals. Ratification would signal seriousness in non-escalatory, non-provocative means of managing competition in the South China Sea. China threatens maritime law and global oceanic norms. U.S. ratification would be a key counterbalance. Pedrosa writes in 2022 that China is a serial violator of UNCLOS. China claims illegal baselines along its mainland coast and illegally conditions the right of innocent passage of foreign warships on prior consent. China's flagrant disregard for the international order and pattern of coercive behavior undermines the rule of law. As the preeminent naval power, the U.S. can be a counterbalance to China's egregious maritime claims by becoming party to UNCLOS. Second is the Arctic. Ratification allows U.S. diplomatic leadership for peaceful Arctic development. Jing and Huff write in 2020 that territorial conflicts need to be addressed early. The U.S.'s best strategy in the Arctic is to be a leading voice in advocating for international collaboration. In a demonstration of good faith to rally nations, the U.S. should ratify UNCLOS. Multilateral cooperation will alleviate perceptions of hegemonic Arctic ambitions by the United States. UNCLOS ratification is key to Arctic conflict mitigation. As Camel 24 of Texas A&M explains, that if the U.S. ratified UNCLOS, it would be able to contest Russian expansion in the region and gain access to the convention's dispute resolution procedures. UNCLOS is the only binding legal framework for the region that offers a tangible avenue for resolving conflict claims. The potential for conflict is too significant not to have an intergovernmental forum. Russian Arctic standoff risks accidental war. Only diplomacy through UNCLOS solves that. Foreign Policy 20 writes that Arctic great power competition is set to intensify. Increased military capabilities magnify the likelihood and severity of a potential misunderstanding. Lack of communication heightens the risk while making conflict harder to de-escalate. Because UNCLOS would increase U.S. credibility and increase global stability, I strongly affirm.
Cool. Is everyone ready for cross?
Yes.
Perfect. Let's begin by talking about your sole contention about credibility. Let's start on the Arctic Council scenario. So you've said that uniquely the United States is going to actually curtail Russian expansionism that's happening in the Arctic. But since Russia is part of the Arctic Council, what does the United States joining UNCLOS actually do to resolve that problem?
I don't think the affirmative mentioned the Arctic Council. Our argument is that Russia is making claims in the Arctic that are not in line with UNCLOS, and the U.S. can't do anything about that right now. If we were to ratify it, we would be able to do something about that. And also, U.S. joining UNCLOS would signal to allies that it does not have hegemonic ambitions and will increase its soft power and legitimacy.
Okay, let's talk about this idea of preventing Russian expansionism. Why would Russia all of a sudden decide to stop actually causing this escalation in the Arctic just because the United States joined the treaty?
Well, because the U.S. is a major global power, right? Increasing U.S. legitimacy would be something that deters Russia from coming into the Arctic.
Okay, so why exactly does increasing legitimacy just mean that all of Russia just goes away?
I don't think our argument was that increasing U.S. legitimacy will mean that all of Russia will go away. But obviously, legitimacy and soft power are things that matter and are things that contribute towards deterrence. They're obviously useful, right?
Okay, let's go on to talking about your scenario about the South China Sea. You've made the argument that the United States is uniquely key to counterbalance against China. How exactly does the counterbalance happen, and what specific provisions in UNCLOS allow this to happen?
Yeah, our Feynman evidence is really great on this question. It mentions a couple of reasons. First is allies. Our evidence indicates that allies see U.S. non-membership as a liability and makes it more difficult for the U.S. and those allies to cooperate. Our argument also talks about how we undermine U.S. leverage by not signing up to the same rulebook, i.e. UNCLOS, in the South China Sea.
Okay, let's talk about this idea of a liability. Why specifically do other powers view the United States as a liability, and why are they prevented from cooperating?
Yeah, because in the status quo, authoritarian states such as China and Russia can call the U.S. hypocrites when the U.S. tries to say, hey, China, you're doing all these bad things in the South China Sea. China will respond by saying, well, the U.S. isn't even a part of UNCLOS, and that decreases our perception, which we argue is something that is bad.
Okay, then finally, let's talk about your Sino-Russian high ground argument. You made the argument that Russia is making claims against the United States, but have you actually read evidence that says that other countries' credibility in terms of the United States has been affected by this?
Our evidence says that, quote, ratification of UNCLOS would plug a glaring gap in the U.S. position that opens it up to charges of hypocrisy. I feel like that's pretty
So
explicit.
you don't have any specific examples?
What?
Okay. I will take 30 seconds of prep, and I will start that time now. I can just use this. But...
Thank you.
Okay, so for a brief off-the-clock roadmap, it's going to be my case and then their case. Is anybody not ready for me to begin? Perfect. I negate resolved, the United States ought to become party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. I agree with their value and criterion, which means that the winner of this debate should be which world is going to maximize well-being for the general public. We're ultimately going to prove to you that the United States joining UNCLOS is going to be bad for general welfare. My first contention is U.S. strength. UNCLOS would damage the United States on the international and domestic stage for three key reasons. First is entrepreneurship. Historically, countries have utilized UNCLOS policy for political gain. The United States would face difficulties which would kill economic development. As Bando writes, that the convention is one of the rare treaties to articulate a basic environmental norm in unqualified form. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with environmental norms, but that is unlikely to emerge from a highly political process like the loss negotiations, which risks endorsing very bad environmental policy. For example, South Africa declared that the concept of sustainable development is a principle in which the African group embraces, and the Netherlands pushed the Council to apply a precautionary approach. The serious application of the precautionary principle would halt economic development. Regulatory activism would inhibit entrepreneurship, and a secure economic environment would be particularly important for entrepreneurs entering high-risk investment fields. Second is foreign control. Ratifying UNCLOS gives legitimacy to China's abuse of this treaty that allows them to exploit foreign competitors through exclusive economic zones, which are known as EEZs for short. As Cary writes, that the UNCLOS is deeply flawed. The creation of EEZs established new claims and conflicts that never before existed. China has assumed rights in the EEZs that weren't intended by the framers. These rights extend security as well as economic rights to the limits of the EEZ and preclude routine military surveillance. This isn't the time to call for UNCLOS accession, it's time for a debate on the merits of UNCLOS and the wider perspective. This isn't a rule of law issue, it's a contract issue, and UNCLOS is a bad contract. Third is naval autonomy. Ratifying would deck claims to its continental shelf and kill autonomy on the sea. As Holmes writes, that the U.S. already has clear legal title and rights to resources of its continental shelf. The treaty's navigational provisions offer nothing new. The Navy could go anywhere in international waters, and UNCLOS reflects the 1970s new economic order ideology that viewed ocean riches as the common heritage. Were the U.S. to join, it would share with developing nations any royalty revenue generated on its continental shelf beyond the 200-mile mark, and the United States would have no veto over its decisions. Consensus often works against the United States in the UN, and the convention would force the U.S. to settle any claim brought against it by another treaty member, which means that corrupt nations would game the United Nations for selfish gain. And U.S. leadership in strength is important because it upholds alliances and endorses democratic values globally. As Brands in 2018 writes that America has committed to overwhelming primacy. The United States consistently maintained power production in Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East, and dominance constituted the hard power backbone of global strategy, advancing liberal political values, suppressing rogue states, nuclear proliferation and terrorism, and military power underwrites alliance commitments. Contention 2 is climate change. Deep seabed mining is not happening now because there is not an incentive. As Whitaker in 2024 writes that 34 Republican senators have turned thumbs down and have subjugated the United States to the UN Law of the Sea. U.S. companies interested in mining want legal guarantees even as others move ahead. However, the act means that the United States gets access to deep sea mining. As Gilbert and Bazillion in 2024 write that UNCLOS would open up deep sea mining and ratify bolster critical mineral supply. And deep sea mining is disastrous for the ocean as it kills biodiversity and ecosystems. As Chandrasekhar in 2024 writes that the impacts of deep sea mining on climate is large. Misconceptions leading to miscalculations of environmental impacts. A disturbance from a single operation could easily be up to 4 times larger than direct footprint. The cost of restoring damage to deep sea ecosystems is astronomical, and there's no foreseeable way in which deep sea mining could be sustainable. Mining harms organisms crucial for climate regulation, those that store carbon. And the loss of biodiversity in the ocean is detrimental to humanity. As Palmer in 2017 writes that marine biodiversity is a critical aspect of sustainable development, supporting the healthy planet and services that underpin well-being and humanity. The ocean is critical to the functioning of the planet, supplying half of the oxygen and absorbing 26% of carbon dioxide emitted. With that, let's move on to the affirmative case, starting on their argument, on their sole contention about credibility, with their argument about the Sino-Russian high ground. Ultimately, there are a few things to note here. First is that they actually make this entire issue worse because this means that Russia will be able to gain more of a high ground in their world. If the United States joins the treaty, they would suddenly be responsible for actually complying to all of the UNCLOS provisions that are currently in place, which means that Russia will be able to take advantage of them not actually adapting to those provisions yet, which would make the issue even worse. Secondly, my contention directly turns this issue because it shows that it incentivizes more things like lawsuits and reduces autonomy, which is worse for credibility on the United States stage as a whole. Third is that we've proven in cross-examination that they actually could not even tell you what countries were actually affected as a result of this in the first place, which overall means that their evidence is speculative, which means you should prefer my evidence because it examines historical UNCLOS policy. Fourth is that there's an extremely large jump because there's no reason why Russian instability is actually going to be enough to cause their global instability impact as a whole. Then, move on to their argument about the South China Sea. You can flip this argument against them because they make SCS escalation even worse, as there are key provisions in the treaty that have already been subverted. Ratification would cede to interpretations that undermine the freedom of navigation and expand Chinese jurisdiction, as Pedroso in 2023 writes that it would be a grave mistake to advocate accession, because provisions reflect CIL. The U.S. already has access as a matter of right without subjecting to disastrous dispute settlement. Given growing number of states asserting claims, the convention has failed miserably. Provisions are abused, illegally extending jurisdiction that is detrimental to navigational rights. Not only do we see that the United States already gets a lot of these benefits now because they treat it as customary international law, we prove that the act makes it worse because they just give China the power to abuse this treaty. Then finally, go on to their argument about Arctic escalation. Ultimately, UNCLOS cannot resolve Arctic disputes, as Holmes in 2008 writes that the Arctic will become increasingly valuable. The language of UNCLOS is ambiguous about how to decide overlapping claims that are likely to develop. Arctic nations have opted out of binding resolution for such claims under UNCLOS. Second is that there's no reason why Russia is actually going to listen to them. They are rivals, and just because they have followed these provisions does not mean that Russia is actually just going to follow U.S. commands and stop escalation that they are doing in the Arctic. For all those reasons, I urge a negative ballot and stand over for cross.
Okay. Everybody ready for a cross? Can you explain to me how joining UNCLOS hurts entrepreneurship?
Sure, so that is my first piece of evidence. It's the Vando evidence. It specifically talks about how the provisions that are specifically in UNCLOS, such as things like requiring the United States to transfer royalty rates, is going to be bad for American businesses.
Okay, what royalty rates will they be required to transfer? Can you elaborate on those royalties?
So the essential argument that we are making is in the Holmes evidence and as well as the Vando evidence. It specifically talks about how if the United States were to join the treaty, quote, it would have to share with developing nations any royalty revenue generated on its continental shelf beyond the 200 nautical mile mark. This means that insofar as there are tons of industries that are actually doing things in their own continental shelf, in their own exclusive economic zone, they're going to lose these claims that they currently have and harm entrepreneurship.
You just told me the U.S. would only have to share resources it gets from areas outside of its continental shelf. If businesses are operating within the continental shelf in the status quo, how would UNCLOS affect them?
So the argument is essentially that businesses are able to do that right now. However, in their world, you're going to join UNCLOS and cause these businesses harm insofar as the United States would have to do things such as transferring royalty rates and diverting that money to nations. We say that harms entrepreneurship because businesses are going to lose profit.
I understand. What businesses would these royalties affect? What does your evidence say about that?
So the evidence specifically talks about how sort of entrepreneurship is going to be harmed as a whole insofar as there would be strong amounts of regulations that occur across the United States, across different businesses, due to different regulations that are under
how would UNCLOS result in regulations of U.S. domestic businesses that are like on land or?
Well, it's not even just a question of domestic businesses, it's also businesses that are sort of responsible for things such as trade and things like that. My Vando evidence is very good on this question because it specifically talks about how historically countries have pushed the councils to do things like applying the precautionary approach. This happened when the Netherlands specifically told UNCLOS to do this, and it caused a serious application of that, which ultimately halted economic development.
Sure. Let's talk about your second contention about climate change. You say that there isn't an incentive to do deep sea mining now, but UNCLOS would create that incentive. Why would UNCLOS create that incentive?
Sure. So specifically, the Gilbert evidence says that UNCLOS would actually open up deep sea mining. Right now, we've said that right now they do not actually have access to large amounts of deep sea beds currently in the status quo, and businesses do not have an incentive to do that right now because they do not actually have legal guarantees, which is what the Whittaker evidence says. However, UNCLOS actually has the provisions and gives them the legal guarantees to allow these businesses to do those things.
Okay. Judge, I will take just running prep time. Start
Yeah, 1 second, I just need to,
sorry.
yeah, take your running prep time.
All right, start. Okay, that was 2 minutes and 22 seconds. Okay, the order of this speech will be starting on the affirmative case and then moving to the negative case. Is everyone ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Then 4 minutes will begin now. Extend our first contention about U.S. credibility. Right now, lack of UNCLOS ratification allows authoritarian states to paint the U.S. in a negative light and allows them to get away with routine violations of international law. When the U.S. calls China out for its egregious claims in the SCS, for example, China can respond by calling us out for not even being a part of the treaty, which allows these authoritarian states to increase influence and make us look bad on the international stage. They give you a couple of responses, none of which really hold up. They say that in the world of the affirmative, it's going to get worse because Russia can take advantage of the U.S. not adapting to the UNCLOS provisions. But they have conceded R1AC evidence, which tells you that the U.S. is already consistent with what UNCLOS says in the status quo, and they themselves say that the U.S. follows UNCLOS in the status quo, which means this argument does not make sense. They also say we do not have examples for this argument, but we've given you the examples of Russia and China in our evidence that they conceded. Now, move to our first scenario about the South China Sea. Extend our Feynman 24 evidence, which tells you that UNCLOS prevents miscalculation in the SCS by increasing U.S. credibility, strengthening alliances. This is critical as China threatens maritime law and oceanic global norms, risking escalation. Their responses don't make sense. They say that UNCLOS has failed historically. Well, yeah, that's because the U.S. was not in UNCLOS historically. Our argument is that becoming party to UNCLOS will increase UNCLOS's legitimacy, and will also increase U.S. legitimacy, which will deter China. Now, go to our second scenario about the Arctic. Ratification allows U.S. diplomatic leadership for peaceful Arctic development. If the United States ratifies UNCLOS, it would be able to contest Russian expansion in the region and gain access to the convention's dispute resolution procedures. That's critical as Russian Arctic standoff risks accidental war, with cooperation mechanisms being vital for de-escalation. They just tell you that, oh, UNCLOS is ambiguous, but you should do the comparative. Even if UNCLOS is ambiguous, that's much better than not having any dispute resolution mechanism at all. Our argument is also not just about UNCLOS, it's also about increasing U.S. credibility generally. They also tell you that Russia won't follow the treaty either way. Our argument is not that Russia will magically become benevolent in the world of the affirmative, but rather that joining and increasing U.S. influence would be a step in the right direction in terms of deterring Russia. Now, let's move on to their case. Here is the top level issue. The resolution does not ask whether UNCLOS is good or bad, but rather whether the U.S. specifically ought to join. So, when considering their contention, you should keep this in mind that they have to prove that there is a unique net harm to the U.S. joining. They talk about this argument about royalties, but this does not make sense. The royalties collected are trivial. As Amandi and Monsieur write in 2024, that deep-sea mining taxes would provide insignificant financial benefits to countries. States receive on average a trivial amount, which takes out this argument. In cross-examination, they could not explain this argument. They did not tell you what industries exactly were hurt and how they were hurt by UNCLOS. Now, on their second contention about control, they talk about how China will be able to be more expansionist in the world of the affirmative, but this is not the case. Our argument is that when we ratify UNCLOS, we increase our legitimacy, which deters China. Their third argument is about naval autonomy. They say the treaty offers nothing new and the U.S. already follows the treaty. If the U.S. already follows the treaty, that's just a reason we should ratify it because there is no net harm. Now, on their last argument about deep-sea mining is already available to the U.S. There's no reason they can't do it in the status quo. The reason is they're not doing it is because there's no incentive, and UNCLOS does not provide a unique incentive to do deep-sea mining, which means their contention does not make sense.
I have 3 minutes and 30 seconds left to prep. I will start that now. So for a brief off-the-clock roadmap, I'm going to start by going over my case, and then my opponent's case, and then I'll just be giving some voters. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. We are ultimately proving to you in this speech that UNCLOS is going to be bad for global well-being as a whole because there are two key arguments in this debate that they only spend 20 seconds on. Remember my first contention about U.S. strength, where we tell you which is one place that you should be signing, which is the first voter in this debate. Joining the treaty would destroy the U.S. domestically and internationally. The key argument that you should remember is our home study about naval autonomy. The United States already has the international influence to bring its navy across the globe, but joining UNCLOS means that they would be open to exploitation from foreign nations. The treaty would force the United States to share and portion royalty revenues to other members of the treaty, which makes the U.S. lose its right to their continental shelf as a whole because they cannot gain profits off of it and because they would be required to share those assets with other countries. Additionally, it would leave the U.S. more vulnerable to lawsuits because they would be required to settle disputes, which means that other countries could utilize this opportunity to gain economic benefits and gain money from actually doing these lawsuits. Ultimately, the main thing that you should remember about this argument is that it actually proves that it destroys legitimacy as a whole. Think about all of their arguments: SCS, Arctic, and Sino-Russia escalation. All of those arguments are dependent on the idea that the U.S. is able to obtain legitimacy. But we show that legitimacy is actually going to be harmed, which ultimately proves that my contention is a prerequisite because it makes all of their contentions worse for a few reasons. First, it shows that legitimacy decreases because these states are able to do lawsuits, which makes the United States look bad credibly on a global stage. And secondly, we ultimately prove that the United States would have a lot less economic resources, which means that they would have less of an ability to do things that are actually going to propel their credibility and do things to maintain alliances and help other countries. They made a couple of responses to this question. First, they said that our arguments do not actually show whether the United States joining UNCLOS is good or bad. But we've definitely proven through our home study that joining the U.S. is bad because it would decrease U.S. legitimacy and overall harm autonomy as a whole. Then they say that royalties are trivial, but that ignores the other ones that we provided to you in our evidence, and they have not even explained why you should not let them get new explanations in the 2AR. Then, the last argument that they make is that if the United States follows it, there's clearly going to be no net harm, but we've given you tons of harms outlined in our Holmes evidence, such as portioning royalty revenues, leaving the U.S. vulnerable to lawsuits, which were all studies that were actually done by experts, which is you have to trust it over the word of a high schooler. But with that, let's go on to my second contention about climate change, which is the second key voter in today's debate. Right now, the United States is not involved in deep-sea mining ventures because there is not an incentive, and the companies do not have rights because they have not become party to the treaty. However, ratifying UNCLOS means that U.S. businesses get access to deep-sea mining through provisions. This would be horrible for the environment in a few key ways. First, disturbances large areas of water to become polluted, which causes an impact 4 times larger than the direct footprint alone. Second, it removes the sedimentary layer of the ocean floor, which is crucial because it dissolves CO2, which directly contributes to environmental harms and biodiversity loss. And third and finally, it harms sea life because it pollutes the surrounding environment and kills animals that preserve biodiversity within the oceans. They have not responded to my Palmer evidence that directly indicates that biodiversity should be the largest impact in this round. Think about all the animals and all of their important jobs that they have within the ecosystems. If we kill sea life, we kill the ability for coral to do things such as absorbing toxic gases that go into the ocean. Ultimately, that outweighs all of their arguments that they've made on magnitude because if biodiversity goes down, it causes the collapse of ecosystems and means that the health of the entire planet goes down as a whole, which actually causes more conflicts between different countries because if this happens, it means that more states are going to fight over resources. They've only made one response to this, and they spent 10 seconds on this contention. They just said that deep-sea mining is available now. However, my link evidence directly indicates that it, quote, would bolster mineral supply, and also we've directly indicated to you that it actually means that the United States can access claims to the seabed, which they cannot do now because they do not have legal guarantees. That is what my evidence from 2024 directly tells you. You have to refer my evidence just over their word for it. But with that, let's go on to the affirmative case. Ultimately, we've already turned this app through, and we've proven that they've made all these scenarios worse because they have not done enough responses to my argument on my first contention. But even then, we'll prove why each one of these is wrong in the first place. First, on the Sino-Russian high ground argument, they've basically dropped that there's no reason why Russian instability is going to be enough to actually spill over and cause global stability as a whole in the first place, which overall just means that you cannot actually buy their arguments. Then, on their SCS argument, you can extend my Pedroso 23 study, which directly tells you that they make SCS escalation worse for two reasons. First is that they do not actually receive any benefits from joining UNCLOS because they already follow the provisions in their treaty, which is something that both the affirmative and I both agree on. But the second thing that's key to remember is that they actually cause even more SCS escalation because China already has a lot of the power in the treaty because they've accumulated power and have been able to set the rules over time. This overall means that when the United States joins, they cede legitimacy to China, which further causes escalation and allows them to expand their authoritarian regimes, which actually refutes all of their Feynman evidence about preventing mezcal because we proved that we give China more power. Then, on their Arctic argument, we've directly told you that Russia would not be incentivized to stop their expansionism just because the United States joins the treaty. Because the United States is something that is independent from Russia as a whole, which means that they're not going to be able to solve any of these things from happening. There are several key places that you can vote. First is that we ultimately proved my first contention that we make credibility worse, and second, we proved that they worsen climate change, which is the most important impact in the round. Clearly, joining UNCLOS is not going to maximize well-being.
Okay, I have a minute 30 of prep left. I will take it starting now. The order of this speech will just be going over voting issues. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
The key voting issue in this round for the affirmative is our contention about U.S. credibility. U.S. credibility is vital because it is a prerequisite to addressing any of the threats the affirmative talks about. They've conceded our Kasparov evidence throughout this debate, which tells you that strong democratic institutions allow for long-range planning. Democracy is the only proven remedy for nearly every crisis: war, famine, poverty, terrorism, climate change, which proves that democracy, global stability, and U.S. credibility are a prerequisite to all of their arguments. Extend our evidence, which tells you that right now, a lack of unclosed ratification allows authoritarian states to paint the U.S. in a negative light and lets them get away with routine violations of international law. This allows these authoritarian states to increase their influence and make us look bad on the international stage. They give you a couple of responses. They say that, oh, both sides have agreed that we already follow UNCLOS in the status quo, which means there wouldn't be any benefit. No, this argument proves that there would be no unique harm to joining UNCLOS, but when we join UNCLOS, we do get the symbolic benefits and soft power that come with formally being a part of a treaty and the ability to increase collaboration with allies. They say that joining UNCLOS will give China more power, but this argument does not make sense. They say that in the status quo, China has been able to set the rules in UNCLOS. Our argument is that when we join UNCLOS, we deter China from doing that by increasing our soft power and by increasing our collaboration with allies. Now, the last thing they say is on our second scenario about the Arctic. You should extend it here. Ratification allows U.S. diplomatic leadership for peaceful Arctic development. If the U.S. ratifies UNCLOS, it would be able to contest Russian expansion in the region and gain access to the convention's dispute resolution procedures, and that's critical as Russian Arctic standoff risks accidental war, with cooperation mechanisms being vital for de-escalation. They say that, oh, we can't deter Russia or we can't prevent Russia from just doing whatever it wants. No, obviously increasing influence and increasing our deterrence is something that is good and would prevent escalation. Now, let's go on to their voting issues. The key issue with the arguments they bring up in the 2NR is empirical evidence. They have not explained or given empirical evidence for their claims. They mention this argument about royalties and how U.S. entrepreneurship will go down. How does this happen and where has this happened historically? Where will the lawsuits come from? None of these questions are answered. But on their second argument about deep sea mining, they have conceded that we can do deep sea mining in the status quo. Conceded our evidence which says that, quote, the U.S. can deep sea mine without the law of the sea. For more than 30 years, domestic law has established a legal framework for deep sea mining, which proves that UNCLOS is not key. The reason we're not deep sea mining in the status quo is because we don't have the interest, not because we're not a part of UNCLOS. For those reasons, affirmed.
Great round.
Great round.